Hello everyone, Beef141 here, and allow me to introduce you to Sketch Quad. Now that name isn't set in stone, but it's very descriptive. So best I can tell, this is an early 90s Kawasaki KLF300b ATV. Now this thing's got a ton of problems because it was neglected and it's been sitting for a long time, and I picked it up for dirt cheap. But the problem we're going to be talking about today is the clutch. Now this particular ATV has a 5-speed clutchless transmission. That means it's 5 speeds, foot shifter, but you don't have to work a clutch. It's all automated. This is a pretty common setup for ATVs these days. Now what's wrong with this one is the centrifugal clutch is going out, or I should say it's already gone. Now this is a pretty common problem for these particular ATVs, but it can happen to any ATV. Now the symptoms it's exhibiting are that it will move, but you have to rev it out a bit, and you rev it and it doesn't move, and then finally it grabs and it takes off. Also in higher gears, under heavier load, it feels like it's slipping. You can just rev the engine out, but it doesn't really seem to go much faster. So I think the shifting clutch basket is fine, but the centrifugal clutch is shot. So the reason it's over there and I'm over here is because it's pretty loud. It's probably going to be hard to hear me once I get on it. We're going to take it out in the street and I'm going to show you what it's doing. Okay, so I'm on it now. We're in first gear. Hopefully you can hear me. This thing is pretty loud. But basically what's happening is it will move when you rev it, but it's not moving the way it should be. If you've ever driven a clutchless ATV that's working properly, you probably know that it'll start taking off almost immediately as soon as you start revving it. This one doesn't. You rev it and it barely moves, and then eventually you can feel the clutch grab and it'll just kind of take off from there. So we're going to give it gas and show you what it does. So nothing, it should be moving right now. So nothing. And there it grabs. And now it'll go like normal. So we're going to have to turn it around here. And this is going to help me illustrate this more, because the more load that's on it, the harder it is for the clutch to grab, the more it slips. So, should be moving. Got nothing. Oh, there it grabs. So hopefully you can tell what it's doing on the camera. It's basically, it just slips, and then eventually the clutch is finally able to grab and it takes off like normal. It's not quite as apparent when you're on flat ground just riding around, but as soon as you put any kind of load on it, it becomes immediately apparent, because you really have to rev it out before the clutch will actually grab. So we're going to go ahead and roll this into the garage, and we're going to pull the side cover off and take a look at the clutch. Okay, so we got the side cover off, the washer's running in the background. So this is our centrifugal clutch here. This is the centrifugal clutch drum. Inside it is the centrifugal clutch, and then we have our shifting clutch basket. So we're going to go ahead and take the centrifugal clutch off, take a look at it. Okay, just pull this out. I don't want to pull the drum off just yet. So there's our centrifugal clutch, and yeah, it's not in the greatest shape. There is some friction material left, but the friction material is all worn smooth. There should be some grooves in it. So we'll put that aside. Rotate this. There's a little groove in there that will allow the gear to clear. Pull the clutch drum off. Set that aside. I want to go ahead and I don't think there's anything wrong with the shift clutch. but I'm not 100% sure of that. So I'm going to go ahead and pull it apart anyway, so I can make sure that the friction plates are in good shape. Okay, so on the bench here, and I won't really be able to do much until I order some parts, but I want to check the shifting clutch just to make sure that all the frictions and steels are in good shape before I go ahead and order parts. Make sure they're not too worn or glazed. So you see these grooves here. These grooves are very important because this is a wet clutch. Those grooves allow oil to be expelled from between the surface or the friction material and the steel clutch disc so that they can grab. I'm just going to go through here and make sure these are all in good shape. I never suspected there was anything wrong with this, but you know, I have it apart, so I want to make sure that it's in good shape. Don't want to get it put back together and then find that there's other problems. And that's it. Looks like this is all in good shape, so we won't have to replace anything on here. So here's our centrifugal clutch, and as you can see, it's in pretty sorry shape. So the friction material is pretty badly worn. It's not gone, but it is pretty worn. Now on the clutch drum here, we have a one-way clutch in the middle, but that's in good shape. It's still working properly. But if you look at the drum, you notice these grooves that are worn in here. These grooves are worn in from the centrifugal clutch. Now normally from the factory they have grooves cut in them, and the purpose of those grooves is because this is a wet clutch. Those grooves allow the oil to be expelled from between the friction surface and the drum when the clutch engages. But this is worn to the point where it's got grooves in the clutch drum that are mating up with what little grooves are left on the friction material. So as a result, we're ending up with a film of oil between the centrifugal clutch friction material and the drum. So when it goes to grab, that film is in there and it just ends up slipping, and eventually after you rev it out enough, or you sit there with the engine throttled up a bit, it's able to push all that oil out from between the friction material and the clutch drum, and then finally the clutch is able to grab and it operates like normal. So the proper way to repair a worn out clutch like this is to actually just replace the clutch and the clutch drum all as one, but that gets kind of pricey kind of quick. I bought this ATV really cheap, and it's meant to be cheap fun, so putting a whole bunch of money into it kind of defeats that whole purpose. I'm not really looking to spend $300–400 on a clutch right now, and even the aftermarkets are at least $100, and then the quality can be kind of questionable. So instead I'm going to try a little trick to add a little bit of life to this clutch, and we'll just run it until it's completely worn out. So what I'm going to do is I've got this Dremel here with a tiny cutoff wheel, and I'm going to very carefully follow the existing grooves and just recut grooves into here. We're not going to go all the way down to the metal, just enough to get some nice grooves going so that the oil is able to work its way out when the clutch is in operation. And then we will also sand the clutch drum to remove the grooves from there as well. So there's my DIY reconditioned clutch pack. You can see, far from perfect, but these grooves should allow the oil to be expelled from between the friction surface and the steel of the clutch drum. This will of course not make up for the fact that the friction material is pretty thin, but it should give us a little bit more life out of this clutch. So we added grooves to the friction material on the clutch disc, but for the clutch drum we actually want to remove the grooves that are worn in it. As I've mentioned before, this is all to facilitate the oil getting out from between the friction and the steel surfaces so that you can grab properly. So to do this, I've got this little spinny, flappy sanding disc. This is 120 grit. I've also got 80 if this isn't taking off enough material. And I'm using a drill instead of a die grinder because it's going to be a little slower and easier to control. And we're going to go all the way around and try to make sure that this is still perfectly circular and get out those grooves. It's not important to get them all out, but to get it as smooth as possible would be really nice. Alright, so I ended up going with the angle die grinder after all. I originally wanted to stick with the drill so that it wouldn't take off too much material at once and be easier to control, but I simply wasn't really making any progress with that, so I did go to the die grinder. I started with the 80 grit because the 120 wasn't making much progress either, so I went with the 80 grit to get most of the grooves out, and then the 120 grit to smooth it out just a bit more. And this is the end result. Don't know how well you're going to see it, but we've got, I'd say, about 99% of the grooves out. There's really just shadows, and you might be able to feel them just a tiny bit, but most of them are gone. It's pretty smooth, so this will provide an excellent surface for our clutch to grip to. I did remove the one-way clutch. It normally sits in here. I knew it would get very dirty if I left it there, so I just pulled it out. So we'll get this clutch drum and the clutch all cleaned up. We'll put the one-way clutch back in, throw it back on the ATV, and see how it does. So I got the clutch reinstalled, about to put the cover back on. Now I will say that in retrospect I definitely should have used the thinner, lighter duty blades for this. The blade that I used is actually a little bit thicker. It's more of a heavy duty blade, and as a result the grooves are just a bit too wide. The thinner blade would have been easier to control. It would have put thinner grooves in there, which would have been better. And if you're going to do this at home, I definitely recommend using the thinner blades. The only reason I went with the big one is because that's the only one that I had. Now I'm not too concerned about the effect it's going to have on this ATV because the clutch was in such bad shape before. It's really only going to get better. And I'm not too concerned about getting a ton more life out of this clutch. The friction material is already pretty thin, so I don't expect it to last forever. And with the amount that I'm probably going to ride this, if I have to replace the clutch in 2-3 years, which it'll probably last another 2-3 years given the amount of use it'll get, then, you know, I'm okay with that. Okay, so it's getting a bit dark now. Hopefully you can see it, but I got it running. Been running it around a bit just to test it out, and the clutch is significantly improved. It grabs pretty much instantly. So we're in first gear now. Give it a little bit of gas, and it starts to cruise just like it should. And then we'll just try giving it hard throttle for the stop. So we got her pulled into the garage here. It's way too dark to see anything out there at this point. So the clutch is working phenomenally. It engages almost immediately. It grabs hard even under heavy load. You get a little bit of creep if you just give it a tiny bit of throttle, which is exactly what it's supposed to do. And when you kick it into gear from neutral, you even get a little bit of a kick from it, which is the way they normally act. So everything is working perfectly. Couldn't have asked for it to go better than that. So that's going to wrap this up. So if you've got any questions, comments, concerns, leave them down below.